Test.
Well, good morning, everyone. No, I am not Scott. He has the Punies, and so he asked me to take the class. Now, I am not going to try to take Scott's material and teach it to you today. Obviously, he and I are two very different types of teachers, and that's good for Kimball. You need different teachers and variety. So what I decided to do is I am going to hit on all sides of what Scott is teaching you today. Now that sounds funny, but what we're going to do is put the book of Numbers into its biblical context. And don't know that we've ever done that exactly the way I plan to this morning, but we're going to use one word as our key word for all 5 books of what is called the Torah, the law. And that one word is beginning. We're going to look at all the beginnings that we read about in the Torah. Now, interestingly, the first book of our Bible is from the Hebrew word Bereshith, and that literally means beginning. That's what the book of Genesis in the Hebrew is called, Bereshith, beginning. And truly it is the book of beginnings. In the first few chapters, we have the beginning of creation. Now, I realize today a lot of people say that, what we see around us evolved and all this, that, and the other. I love the Hebrew writer's use of Aristotle's logic when he makes the statements, all things are built by someone, and he who built all things is God. Now let me say, not everyone who is involved in science is a Darwinist. There are many people out there who will acknowledge there is a creator. There is a starting point. There is someone who began this, and that someone had to be the master of masters of organization and knowledge. And so we have the beginning of creation. We have the beginning of the human race. And of course, that was God's crowning creative act. You have a being who is like animals, but not an animal. Remember, the animals were created out of the dust of the earth just like Adam was. So he's like an animal, but he's not an animal. He's like God, made in God's image, but he's not God. And so we have then the beginning of the human race. And it has been well documented by those who are involved in genetics and DNA studies and so on, that the possibility of all of the races and all the different genetic differences that we see in human beings today could go back to 2 ancestors. So once again, the Bible tends to be approved by that. Okay, we have the beginning of sin. And of course, this is going to be the thing that undoes the human race and still undoes the human race today. And so sin, in this case, by both participants, was a deliberate act of rebellion against God. Think about it. God only gave them 2 commands. One was positive, one was negative. Take care of this lovely garden that I've created for you. Don't eat the tree in the midst of the garden. That's pretty simple. You know, most people could understand that. But we also have the fact that with sin comes temptation. Now, all of you fishermen understand exactly what temptation is all about, because that's what you're doing when you're fishing. You're trying to tempt Mr. Bass to bite that lure you've thrown out there. And so Satan is a fisherman. So sin enters the world, and a lot of consequences come as a result of that. Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. A lot of the blessings that God had in the beginning with the perfect creation are undone, and the world really becomes a not very nice place in which to live. But we also have the beginning of something else. Right in the midst of God's denouncement and punishments for sin, we have the first promise. The promise of a Redeemer. And so as soon as sin enters the world, the promise of salvation comes along with it. And that will be a theme, I'll call it the golden cord, that sews the entire Bible together. Now, basically in the Old Testament, as we look at Jesus, just a quick little summary that's easy to keep in your mind. Someone is coming. We will be told that more than 350 times. In fact, you can pretty much take the Old Testament if you want to, and you can paint the life of Christ. Now, we have the ability to look back and understand how to do that. They didn't, because the prophecies came here, there, and yonder. But we have the ability to do that. And it is a marvelous thing indeed. And so someone is coming. And that someone is going to undo what was done in the garden. Well, as we move on quickly in the book of Genesis, we see the result of sin. Sin with human effort never gets better. In fact, it gets worse. And so by the time we come to chapter 6, God's throwing up his hands. He's actually sorry that he had created the human race. He was shaking his mighty head. And so he decides he is going to, shall I say, re-begin the earth. And so he chooses 8 people. Have you ever really thought about the significance of that? Now, I can't give you a population number at the time of Genesis chapter 6, but, there had to be thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people on the earth, if maybe not approaching, millions. And so here were all of these people, and of all of them, God can only find one family. And so he entrusts them with the project of saving humanity. I like to say this, and it is kind of funny, but, the Titanic was built by professionals and sunk on its maiden voyage. The Ark was built by amateurs and survived the greatest storm in history. So that's kind of an interesting thing. By the way, the builders said not even God himself could sink the Titanic. He didn't. An iceberg did that, and faulty construction, but God didn't have to sink the Titanic. Okay, so we have the storm, the earth is cleared, and so we begin again. And of course, Noah and his family took animals into the ark. By the way, if you have never been to the Art Museum up in Kentucky, let me recommend you go. That's an experience well worth your time and effort to go see that thing. Now, I will say one thing about it. They used the larger cubit measure. There were actually 2 cubit measures. One of them was generally considered about 18 inches, and that's from the tip of your middle finger to your elbow. The larger cubit was about 2 feet, and that's the measures they used in the one in Kentucky. And so it's a big boat, believe me. It's a big boat. And I learned 2 things I did not know from Genesis. That Moses had Pepsi, and that there was air conditioning. Now, I did not know either of those things were on the ark, but when we went to the ark thing, there was Pepsi and there was air conditioning. So, what can I say? We think we're so modern and up to date, and maybe we're not after all, John. Oh, okay. I'm coming to Moses. Okay. Noah and them, not Moses. Not Moses. Okay. Okay. Yeah, much smaller. All right. Moving on, we have the beginning of a family that's going to grow. Abraham is selected, and it will be through his family that the someone will actually come. And, you know, Abraham is kind of a remarkable guy when we think about him. He is living in probably the most advanced city on earth, the earliest center of civilization, hence your Western Civ professor here. Sumeria, that was the earliest civilization on earth and quite advanced. In fact, there's a neat book if you like to read books. Matthew, you'll enjoy this one. I'm picking on you. It is called Everything Began in Sumer. Now, the Greeks hate it because, you know, if you go to Greece, they're going to tell you everything began with them. But the book is pretty accurate that a lot of what became civilization actually began in Sumeria. It preceded Egypt by a couple of 100 years, to say the least. So here he is in Ur of Chaldees, modern city, and God says, get out of there and go where I'm going to show you. And so he and some of his family pick up and go. They go to Haran. His father dies. Haran would be in Syria. And then he moves on into the land of Canaan. So we have the beginning of that family, through whom ultimately 2 sets of blessings will come. One will be the physical blessing of the nation of Israel and all it will give the world. The second will be the spiritual blessing of the Messiah and all that he will give the world. And so the rest of the book of Genesis revolves around that beginning with Abraham and his family. All right, we go to the book of Exodus. Wa'eli Shemoth. Those are the first words of the book, and that literally means these are the names. And we have the names of the sons of Jacob being listed there. Of course, Joseph was sent to Egypt. He finally became what some people would call a viceroy or whatever. He moves his family down there at a time when Egypt was in what we call an intermediate period. You know, the Egyptian Empire did not last from 3400 BC until the time of Julius Caesar. It gets whooped, and it gets re-whooped, and it gets whooped again, and it gets whooped and whooped and whooped. In fact, just about everybody whooped up on them eventually. But during one of those intermediate periods, a group of people called the Hyksos, probably Aryans. Oh, you mean Billy believes in Aryans? Yeah, I do. Hitler had it all wrong. Now, let me say that up front. The Aryans were not blonde-haired, blue-eyed superhumans from Scandinavia. They were dark-haired, dark-eyed, semi-superhumans from the Steppes region, who probably in the ancient world were the most influential people. They will at one time conquer China. They will conquer India, where they had their primary influence. They will conquer Mesopotamia. They will conquer parts of Egypt. They will go across Europe. We will finally know them in Europe as the Celts. But in the Bible, we know their background in the Assyrians, in the Hittites, and yes, even in the Hyksos people. And so they were a very, very, very influential race. By the way, if you want to counter to that, in Africa, it was the Bantus. They had basically the same effect across the African continent as the Aryans had across that northern continent. Okay, so they had come in, they had conquered Egypt. And so when we get to the book of Exodus and we read about a king that did not know Joseph, that's the biblical way of telling us that the Egyptians have overthrown the Hyksos and driven them out. Okay, the Jews were friends with the Hyksos. So what are you going to do to people that were friends with the people that conquered you? Enslave them? So you do.
So the Hyksos are also known as the shepherd kings.
That's what the word actually means, shepherd king.
But when Israel came, they were told to stay away and keep your people over in Goshen because the people hate shepherds. So isn't that kind of doesn't that put a hiccup in your timeline there?
No, it's definitely the Hyksos that are those shepherd kings. And the date plan, by that is pretty much solid by biblical scholars.
Well, so what about the fact that the Egyptians hated, and so they moved them into Goshen to keep them away from, because they hated shepherds?
What many of the scholars say, and I guess I ought to stay on the camera, what many of the scholars say is that because of their warlike nature, they turned against that original background. They did in India. They were not shepherds by any stretch of the imagination in India. They were very, very brutal conquerors. They're actually the ones that set up the caste system. We're the conquerors, we're the superiors, you're the inferiors, and here we go. So somewhere on that march westward, they gave up that original pastoral type of lifestyle and literally become riding horseback warriors. And so by the time they hit Egypt, that's where they are. And they conquer India before Egypt. So anyway, so much for that. So we come to this plight. And so in the book of Exodus, we have the beginning of a new nation. God is going to ultimately call Moses, empower him, send him down, and Moses, with God's help, God's mighty arm, as Scripture seems to say over and over again, will deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt. So here we go. Now, I will say something, and there's a lot of people that, okay, they get confused on the time. Paul, in the New Testament, talks about from Abraham to the deliverance of being a period of about 430 years. Now, people get the idea that the Israelites were totally enslaved for that entire period. And that doesn't appear to be the fact. The enslavement actually was probably totally less than 100 years, maybe even not that long. So do not think that there's a 400-year enslavement there. It is a period of slowly but surely deteriorating relations until they do become enslaved. So we have a new nation that has popped forth on the earth, but right now that new nation doesn't have anywhere to plant itself. So that is yet future. But there is the promise that God is going to give them a land. And that is a theme I want you to really keep in your mind. God is going to give them that land. They didn't take it by their own might and power, believe me, because when they finally get there, you've got a bunch of nomads going up against seasoned warriors in walled cities, and they're going to get whooped big time because of God himself. Okay, so the nation begins. Also, we have the beginning of a new way to worship God. God's going to establish a formal type of religion for the Jewish people. It will revolve initially around the tabernacle, which was basically a prefab building that they could move around in the wilderness, put up very quickly, take down very quickly, and go here, there, and yonder. The ultimate for that plan would be that when they got into the land that God would give them, he would name a city where they would build a permanent structure for him. And so the law of Moses begins. And basically then, the greater part of the book of Exodus is a description of how to build the tabernacle, how to get the priestly garments ready, so on and so forth. All right, in the book of Leviticus, probably to us one of the most difficult books in all the Bible, we have, and I'll call it a beginning again, the stressing of the different types of sacrifices for the different types of sins, as well as how the priesthood was supposed to function, as well as the giving and codifying of new laws. Now, Moses is not the first person to write laws. Hammurabi, part of that Sumerian plan, probably a contemporary, by the way, of our buddy Abraham. But Hammurabi is the first person to codify law, and we know that because we actually have one of his obelisks that had the series of laws. And one of Hammurabi's laws was very earth-shaking. The law of Moses will incorporate it. That the king answered to the same law the pauper did. That was unheard of in the ancient world. It didn't happen. You know, you part of the royal family, you had diplomatic immunity, so to speak, Mike. Not under Hammurabi's law, not under the law of Moses. And so that very difficult book of Leviticus is a book telling us their sacrificial system, when it was to come into effect, how to celebrate the 3 annual feasts, which were all very, very important to them. And then the most significant event of each year, the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the most holy place, first with blood for himself, because he had sinned, second with blood for the people, and sprinkle it on the mercy seat, on the Ark of the Covenant. Then there would be 2 goats. One would be sacrificed. The other, the high priest would lay his hands on it, symbolically putting all the sins of the people on the goat, and it would be driven into the wilderness. Now, that kind of sounds strange to us, but that is the way God wanted things to be. The law of Moses was a very visual religion. You sinned. You carried your, since we don't have any little kids in here, you sinned. You carried your sacrifice to the priest. You watched the priest execute that sacrifice, cut it up, and burn it in offering to God. It was very visual indeed. God was trying to impress people with the seriousness of sin. And I'm just going to throw a sub footnote here. Didn't work, but he tried. Okay, Numbers. Numbers is interesting. It's kind of the history book of the wandering in the wilderness. We find out in it why they rebelled against God. Now, not to trample on what Scott's going to be covering, but it is interesting to me, they saw 10 plagues on the land of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea miraculously. God is giving them food. They are getting water in places that water ought not exist. They've got a pillar of cloud by the day to show God's presence, a pillar of fire by night to show God's presence. They have already defeated one enemy whom they were not prepared to fight, but they defeated anyway because of the power of God. And so God selects a man from each tribe, sends them into the place. They come back, and boy, wouldn't you like to see a cluster of grapes that it takes 2 men to carry? That must have been Grapezilla or whatever, but boy. And they come in. Oh, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. God hasn't hidden anything from us except there are giants in the land. And we look like little old grasshoppers compared to them. And 10 of them scare the people to death. So much so that they balk. Now, instead of 40 years in the wilderness, they would have probably spent 2 getting the tabernacle ready. But because they decide to balk and don't listen to the 2 people that are saying, Joshua and Caleb, let's go take the land, They wind up wandering in the wilderness, and everybody over 20 years old, except those two, will wind up dying in the wilderness. So yes, Numbers is a book of beginnings. We have the numbering of the people at the beginning of the journey. We have the renumbering of the people at the end of the 40 years. So it is a book of beginnings as well. And of course, one thing that is important about the book of Numbers is the fact that in it is a good bit of the guidance that Moses will give the children of Israel on dividing up the land via the tribes. And so a lot of that guidance is there. All right, Book of Deuteronomy. Definitely a beginning book. This is 3 sermons that Moses preaches to the new generation. That old generation that didn't trust God's gone. The generation they said that would be devoured by the people in the land of Canaan is on the verge of going in and taking the land of Canaan. So get that picture. You know, our children are going to be devoured. No, your children are going to do what you didn't do. Very, very simply. Now, the first sermon basically is a quick history lesson. This is where we came from. This is where we are. Now, it's really interesting. Moses gets in a couple of blows. I can't go into the land of Canaan because of you. Moses dishonored God, and he's not going to be allowed to go into the land of Canaan. Now, I'll be honest, folks, and I will admit this readily. Moses put up with a whole lot more, a whole lot longer than I ever would have put up with that bunch of people. I mean, that guy was really, really patient. I would have lost my temper with him a long time before he did. In fact, probably at Mount Sinai, when God wanted to destroy him, I'd have said, have at it, Lord. Take them out. Let's start over. Maybe we can do better. But he didn't do that. So he gives them a little history lesson. And then the other 2 lessons, and these are very important lessons for them and for us, are obey God, because it's good for you. And really, almost every column, if you have columns in your Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy is going to have something about obey God. It'll be good for you. It'll be good for your children. It'll be good for the land. Just obey God. At one point, Moses would say, don't go to the right, don't go to the left. You know, just obey God. Obey God, and God's going to give you all of these blessings. The plagues of Egypt will never bother you. You'll have rains when you need them. Your crops will produce. All of these wonderful things will happen for you if you obey God. But if you don't, woe to you. You're going to regret not obeying God. And literally, in the latter chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to predict the Babylonian captivity. You're going to be carried away into a land where they speak a language you don't even speak because you rebelled against the Lord. And there's a warning there. And that warning is really, really, really important for you and I. Don't forget Yahweh God. Don't. Because the time we get to the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, you have forgotten God days without number. And so those last few chapters of the book of Deuteronomy are really, really important chapters. Now, a little quick thing. Deuteronomy is the book that ultimately all the kings of Israel will be required to make a copy of, and they are supposed to know the book as well. That's how important the book of Deuteronomy is. Now, there's a whole lot of teaching that, Moses didn't write any of this, and la-di-da-di-da. And one of the so-called writers was the Deuteronomist. Well, I will say this about the book of Deuteronomy. Yes, it does form the foundation of everything else we read in the Old Testament. It is that foundational. And so in that respect, the entire Old Testament becomes Deuteronomic history, because all the kings are going to be measured and compared by this book, by the standard in this book. Okay, quickly, and very quickly, Joshua is a beginning. That nation that we established that didn't have anywhere to go is going to have a place to go. And they are going to go in and they are going to carve out a territory in Canaan. Now, carefully read Joshua and Judges, the first few chapters. No, they did not capture every inch of land with Joshua. There was still work they were supposed to do. They didn't always do it. David will be the one finally complete the deal. But there was still work to do. So they will carve them out of land. Now, on the nation of Israel, and I'm going to paraphrase from my world history textbook, never has such a territorial kingdom, as it is called. That's not a big one. We're not talking about an empire here, like Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome, Chinese, so on. We're not talking about an empire. We're talking about a little territorial kingdom. Never will a territorial kingdom in all of history exert as much influence as the nation of Israel will. Think about that. This is God's nation among the nations in the Old Testament, and this will be the nation from whom someone will come. So hopefully that'll kind of help you a little bit if you've never thought in this light before. Hopefully I haven't confused everybody this morning. Anybody got any comments? Is the water muddy, or can you see the brim floating around in there, Butch? We can see the brim. Okay. Matthew, would you lead us in a prayer, please?
Dear Lord, thank you for this day and the many wonderful blessings that you shower down upon us. Thank you for allowing us to gather here together this morning and to study your word and to learn the history of the foundation of the plan that you put into place to bring Christ in the world and to bring us eternal salvation from sins, Lord. But thank you so much for having the freedom to do this and having the people in place to broadcast it and to do the research and bring us the information, Lord. Please help us as we